Good morning, and welcome to the monthly webcast presented by Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. My name is Robin Miller, and I'm staff attorney at Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. And here today with me is Alan Rossello, who is the Assistant General Counsel at Delta Airlines, where his practice focuses on corporate governance and capital markets. Over the last several years, Alan has represented numerous of our clients, including one involving the formation of a collaborative that will be part of the focus of our discussion today. He also recently joined our board of directors, and we're happy to have him. In addition to his services with Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, he's also the president of the Atlanta Youth Soccer Association, which is a nonprofit organization that serves about 1,500 children in town Atlanta. So I'm very happy to have him here with me today.
Thank you.
Let's turn to slide 2, and I'm going to briefly describe the mission of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, and it is to maximize the impact of pro bono engagement by connecting a network of attorneys with nonprofits in need of free legal business services. If you turn to slide 3 of the presentation, there's a listing of the eligibility requirements to become a client of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but if you do meet these initial requirements, you can go to our website, which is listed on the slide, and complete a request for legal assistance. And we can begin the screening process to see if you can become a client. The last bit of housekeeping information is on slide 4, and that is our legal disclaimers. Today's presentation is providing you with general legal information and is not intended to be specific legal advice. We're going to cover a lot of topics today, and so if you will, in conjunction with collaborations. So if you have specific questions, please contact us for further assistance, legal assistance. So our conversation today is going to be about avoiding conflict in collaborations, addressing legal issues in nonprofit collaborations. On slide 5, we're going to talk about the goal for the presentation, which is to help nonprofits frame questions to ask and things to consider when entering into collaborations. This topic we could spend days on, but we're going to try and focus within a short period of time on some of the key issues.
See if we can keep it to an hour.
That's right. Slide 6 lists our agenda, and this is what we're going to hopefully cover during this time period, since we could spend quite a period of time on it. We're going to try and highlight the benefits and challenges of collaboration, some of the types and forms of relationships, and then a few collaboration structures that are some of the most common structures that you'll see.
And then we'll spend probably the most of our time this morning talking about key issues to consider when collaborating. And we're going to do that by talking about a specific case study, the project in which I was involved with here at Pro Bono Partnership. And so we'll touch on quite a few issues, including the 4 that are listed there at the bottom of slide 6.
So now let's get started. Let's start with some of the benefits of collaboration. So where 2 or more organizations serve the same client base, collaborations amongst nonprofits can provide a more holistic approach to serving the needs of those clients. It can also be an avenue for greater efficiencies and the better use of resources, and often will reduce duplication amongst nonprofits serving the same client base. Collaborating on financial resources can generate additional income to the organizations. It can give you greater options because a lot of times the combined services, a more holistic approach, is something that funders want to see. And they're much more willing to fund that kind of an approach rather than single piecemeal activities. Successful collaborations can provide greater stability and credibility to the individual organizations, one, through the greater financial stability and greater resources that can be obtained, and then also the greater client reach. By being more successful in serving your clients, you may reach more additional clients as well, and the ability to accomplish your mission will increase as a result, and you'll have more efficiency and effectiveness, thereby benefiting the organization in stability and credibility as more people become aware of what you're doing and your successes. But there are lots of challenges as well to collaboration. And the challenges to successful collaboration really cannot be taken lightly. There are many, but with a lot of hard work and communication, you can overcome these obstacles or challenges. First, finding the right collaborators is really important to the process. You need to look for collaborators that have same or complementary goals, expectations, personality, and desired outcomes. And each one of these is critical. If the personality fit between the organizations isn't right, then it won't work. If you don't have common goals, then you're not going to be able to find ways in which you can achieve something together. A second challenge to consider is the hard questions that need to be asked, and then they also need to be answered. So it's really important to not just say, oh yes, we're going to do this, and want to be very light about it. You have to ask all the hard, difficult questions, some of which we're going to discuss today. And then make sure you find answers that are suitable to everyone involved in the collaboration to make sure that it has a chance of success. Third, to put a collaboration together, the leaders of the organization are going to have to invest time and energy of each of the organizations involved. And so they're going to have time away from their own organization in order to see that the collaboration will succeed. So you need to be planning for and mindful of the fact that your leaders may not be as involved in the individual aspects of the individual organizations, but may be focused on this combined effort. And you need to make sure that you have plans in place to adjust for that time difference. Fourth, money. Money is always a huge issue in almost every area. Every aspect of the money relationship amongst the collaboration really needs to be discussed and defined, and we're going to talk about that in further detail later on. And that cannot be overemphasized because that's often where things fall apart. And fifth, I want to mention conflicts of interest. It seems like you would be coming together to collaborate, to pull something together that will be unique as a whole. But at the same time, each individual organization will still exist. And as a result, there may be conflicts between what's going on in the collaboration versus the individual organizations. And then finally, communication. Communication is one of the most critical aspects as well, right there with financial issues. You need to make sure you discuss and plan for communication and how you're going to communicate within the collaboration and outside the collaboration. You're going to get a much better understanding of all these issues as we go through this today, and Alan will provide a real-world example, which I think will really help as we think through a lot of these issues. But before we get into that, I want to briefly talk about sort of the spectrum of relationships to put this into a broader context. So you can go from anywhere from, if you're looking at slide 9, a loose relationship to a complete combination. And collaboration is more towards the complete combination, but not quite there. So you start with coordination. Coordination is where you've got organizations working together, really coming alongside of one another, but still doing their own unique activities and just trying to do it in conjunction with one another. Cooperation is a step further along the spectrum, where organizations are associating to accomplish a common goal. And then we've got collaboration, which is what we're going to focus on today and spend most of our time on, which is where you've got organizations sharing resources, responsibilities to jointly plan, implement, and evaluate programs to accomplish or achieve a common goal. And then mergers is where you actually have the organizations combining and eliminating the excess organizations to become one larger organization to accomplish a greater goal. So now let's just spend a minute on collaboration structures, which are important when first beginning to think about a collaboration. So there's 3 very common structures that you will see amongst collaborations. First is the participation structure, and that's where each organization has responsibilities, and those are divided amongst the various organizations. So they've gotten together as a group of collaborators and have decided what each organization is going to contribute to the collaboration. And then each organization kind of manages that part of its responsibilities on its own, still working together to achieve a common goal. The lead organization structure involves one organization amongst the collaboration taking the lead, as it would sound. And that organization has the authority for overseeing the activities and delegating to the various organizations and making sure that the actual collaboration occurs. The last common structure is the governing committee structure. And that involves all the various nonprofits that are participating to each nominate 1 or 2 members to be on the governing committee, and that governing committee will make all the decisions, strategic decisions for the collaboration, and decide how the collaboration is going to function. It's really important to identify which structure you're going to go with, because without a true structure, you won't be able to accomplish a collaborative effort. Now we're going to turn to this case study.
Right. So before we dig into some of the key issues in establishing the collaborative relationship and how you document that, I want to introduce our case study to put to provide a background for the context. Up to this point, we've defined what the collaboration is and why nonprofit organizations might form this type of relationship. So we'll use this case study that was a collaboration that Pro Bono Partnership helped put together in 2012 to explore those issues. I should note that the relationship that I was involved in is my one experience in putting together collaboration. So I can't claim to have a magic solution for making all collaborative efforts work. And as Robin mentioned at the outset, a lot of it has to do with the personalities of the people and the organizations involved. But we can provide you with some insight into how these 3 organizations came together in a very positive way. So slide 11 shows you the basics of what the case study involved. Essentially, there were 3 entities that were providing different services to the same client base, homeless families in a specific geographic area being that client base. The organizations had developed a very good working relationship, probably on the coordination end of the spectrum that Robin described earlier, but they were still at the same time providing services to clients in other areas. One of the organizations provides emergency shelter for homeless families. One provides rapid rehousing services to those families, and the third provides job placement services. So in short, these organizations were working together successfully, and the formation of the collaborative was to serve 3 purposes for them. One, they wanted to formalize their working relationship, essentially getting specific about how they were working together to serve their common clients. 2, and maybe most importantly, to present a united front for pursuing grants and additional funding for their work together. And 3rd, to provide a framework for a lasting relationship between the entities, a relationship that would outlast their current leadership. So in terms of this relationship, it sits slightly to the left end of the collaboration, if you think back to the spectrum that Robin described, somewhere closer to collaboration than cooperation, but it has some cooperative type elements in it, and you'll understand why I describe it that way as we go through these key issues. Before we dive into the key issues, I just want to say a word or 2 about the purpose of a collaboration agreement. A formal agreement should help memorialize decisions between the entities on these issues. It should help guide how things should be done and how to deal with the unexpected. As we explore these key issues, not all of these were issues for us, but we'll touch on quite a few things. This was in part because these groups were already working together. And on that note, we're at a good point to talk about the first issue, and the most important issue to resolve at the outset, which is the scope of the collaboration. So if we turn to the next slide 12, Robin will introduce the general issues, and then I'll talk about how we dealt with it in our case study.
And to Alan's point, we're going to be talking about all these various issues, but a collaboration agreement is essential to making this work. You have to take all of these issues that we're going to discuss and put it down in writing and agree to it formally in order to really make a collaboration effort truly successful. And the first piece of that is the scope. So it's important to clearly identify what the scope of the collaboration is exactly going to be. It's going to help the nonprofits to define what they're collaborating about and what they're not collaborating about. And while this will help define some of the issues, you're never going to identify all the issues, but it is important to identify as many as possible. So write down what is going to be the mission, purpose, goals, and outcome of this collaboration, or planned outcome of the collaboration. All the parties need to agree to what's written down about this. And this should take a fair amount of time because it should really be well thought out. What is the mission trying to accomplish, and what are your desired outcomes? Then once you get past that point, the next thing to do is to start drilling down beyond each of those to the specific activities that the collaboration is going to undertake to accomplish the mission, purpose, goals, and outcomes that have been defined by the group. The next thing to think about is where these activities are going to take place. So you've identified the big picture, you've identified what the activities are generally going to be, but then where are they going to take place? And who's going to do those activities? How are they going to be conducted? What are the specific services going to be of the activity? And then how are those services going to be paid for is another thing to start thinking about. And this is all very broad level when we talk about scope, and we're going to drill down under each one of these issues further as we go through the rest of the presentation, but it's good to start laying out the broad frame outline as to how this is all going to transpire. One important programmatic issue that I want to mention is lobbying. Sometimes collaborations involve lobbying activities. And while this is just one small section of what the activities could be, this is an important one to identify, because if the collaboration is involved in lobbying and each individual organization may do its own lobbying, those individual organizations need to make sure they're tracking the total amount of lobbying activity they're conducting, because if they have an excessive amount of lobbying, they can lose their tax-exempt status. They may also want to, in considering lobbying activities of the collaboration, consider whether or not they want to make a 501H election. So if you are doing any collaborations that might involve lobbying, there's an extra set of steps that you should be thinking about in terms of your own individual nonprofit and the activities of the collaboration as a whole. Another thing to be thinking about, two other bullet points on this slide involve staff and resources and expenses. So who's going to do the work of the collaboration and how is it going to get done? And we'll get into that a little bit further, but you need to think about, it's a great idea to say, yeah, we're going to collaborate, we're going to do this, but where are those people going to come from to actually accomplish those activities? And where are the resources going to come from to pay for those people to accomplish that activity? And then, of course, the additional expenses associated with these additional activities. Where is that money going to come from? So maybe you can share a little bit about the scope of your collaborative.
Right, and I'll probably spend more time on this topic because, as we've hinted at, if not directly said already, it really is the most important thing to address is to clearly define the scope up front, because it is the most important building block of formalizing a relationship and documenting a collaborative relationship. In the case of this collaborative, most of the scope was already set out when I was asked to get involved, but we didn't have a lot of details to work out. The organizations had limited the scope of their efforts to a specific geographic area and client base, as I mentioned when I was introducing the case study. The primary task then, when formalizing the relationship, was to carefully define between the organizations who was doing what and how. And the point really was to make sure that nothing was being missed, not to define turf between the organizations. So in general, answering the first question is a step back a little more broadly than our case study. Answering the first question should also involve thinking about not only what is in the scope, but what is not. This is pretty basic, but if it's not discussed and defined, it's really hard to move forward. In our case, each of the entities needed to be able to continue to provide the services that they were providing already outside of this relationship. And the agreement needed to allow them to do that, to not bring in more into the relationship than what was necessary. A key here is also the planning and thinking about the future. not only what are the organizations doing now in the collaborative, but what they might do down the road. For example, in our collaborative, they were only in one county, but they had thoughts about broadening their geographic reach. And they might find other organizations providing different services that serve the same client base that they might want to bring into the collaborative as well. So we needed to make sure that the agreement was flexible enough to allow for that kind of expansion, either geographic or including other organizations, without having to tear up the agreement and start all over. So those were the kind of things that we had to think about and make it flexible and broad. Once the clear mission is defined, which ours was at the outset, then the specific activities can be explored. And just as a process point, I should mention what we did here is we had a letter of intent between the three organizations that established the scope and established sort of the big picture. And once we were all on the same page with that, then we were able to narrow in on some of these more specific questions. And so we explored the topics here and others. For example, we defined where and how common office space would be used. We ultimately came to the agreement that the office space would be provided by one of the organizations, and all of the services for their common clients would be provided from that office. We clearly defined, as I mentioned, who was providing what services. Each organization's services are listed on a schedule to the agreement. This included describing how each organization would fulfill reporting obligations, which is very important for a number of reasons, for grant reporting purposes or regulatory reporting purposes or tax purposes. But not only fulfill their own obligations, but how they would support each other in providing their obligations, or each organization supporting the others in fulfilling their obligations. I think I got all that out.
Yes, I think so.
We also made it clear that each organization would continue to be responsible for their own employees, their own insurance. Every organization was responsible for their own expenses related to the collaboration and other topics like that. In our case, this reflects the fact that the collaborative is not a separate legal entity and does not have its own employees, but is a contractual relationship. One of the nice things about formalizing this relationship, as I've already mentioned, is that we didn't have to spend a lot of time talking about the scope because they'd already defined it. And because they defined it and because the entities provide different services to the same client base, we really didn't have to spend a lot of time talking about our next issue, which is conflicts of interest, primarily because they do different things. But I can see situations where conflicts would be of a concern as entities, if they're providing same kind of services in just different geographic areas, and they creep towards each other and things like that. So we were lucky in that we didn't have to think too much about it, but we should move on to that topic to explore that a little bit.
And conflicts of interest can arise in many areas in a collaboration. And there needs to be a plan to address conflicts as they arise. So you're not going to be able to identify all the conflicts ahead of time, but the collaboration should think through how it will address those conflicts as they do arise. They can arise within the context of the group activities, where you might have individuals from different nonprofits that have conflicting ideas or conflicts of what's important to their nonprofit versus the other nonprofit is another big common issue. So within the collaboration, you can have issues, but then you could have the bigger picture conflicts like Alan was discussing, where the organizations themselves, their missions may be similar enough that they could conflict as organizations. That goes back to clearly defining the scope of this relationship, what's in the collaboration and what's not in the collaboration, because they are separate entities and will want to continue to complete their missions. One of the biggest areas where you see collaboration, conflict of interest is fundraising. And we're going to get into that a little more later, but it's a hot topic where there's a lot of conflict because who's going after what funding is you can imagine would have a lot of conflicts related to that.
Yeah, so just to sort of, we did have to, like I said, we didn't have to think too much about it, but that is an area that we actually did have to address a little bit in the context of this case study. Just to step back a little bit again, the best agreement can't prevent bad actions by people who want to act bad. But hopefully it will lay out a structure for people who want to cooperate cooperate and deal with problems as those problems come up. So dealing with a conflict of interest is an example of how an agreement can help in that situation. In general, our agreement is based on, as I said, each organization providing different kinds of services and clearly defining the services that each would provide. And I mentioned also that one of the primary purposes for this collaboration was to pursue funding for joint efforts that they were doing. And you're running all that through a fiscal agent, and we'll talk a little bit more about the fiscal agent concept in a minute. With those sort of building blocks and the reason for the agreement, we did need to make sure that we dealt with potential conflicts in fundraising. And the biggest to put that in a more concrete context, the biggest conflict that we could see would be in seeking grants and the organizations competing with each other for grants that would support the collaborative. And that was obviously something we wanted to avoid. And so we're going to talk about the strategic governance of the organization, but basically we set up a provision so that the governing committee of the collaborative would review all grants and make sure that there wasn't a competition among the organizations and to prevent the conflict of interest from occurring.
So did the grants then go first to the collaborative committee, the governing committee, and then if they decided they weren't going to go after that grant, then the individual organizations could go after it?
Yes, as long as, yes. And we can talk a little bit more about how that was structured, but in general, yes.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about the governing structure now, I guess. Let's see if I moved too far.
Nope. Nice.
There we go. All right, sorry. So in terms of determining, Robin laid out the sort of the different kinds of governing structures. And on this slide, on slide 14, where we talk about oversight and how strategic decisions will be made, there are at least, I think, 3 types of structures, and there's probably combinations of those structures. So the case study is an example of a cohesive, trusting structure between the organizations. And what made the most sense for them was to set up, as I mentioned, a governing committee. The governing committee consists of 3 representatives, 1 from each organization. And at the outset, it was the executive director of each organization, which makes sense because each of these organizations are pretty small, and the executive directors play a very active role in their organizations and coordinating with each other and what their organizations are doing in the collaborative. So the governing committee is 3 people. The chair of the committee, who drives the agenda, drives the meetings, drives the decision-making process for the governing committee, rotates each year. So each one of the executive directors is the chair for a year, and then it passes on, and they just keep going in a rotation. Their committee meets quarterly and more frequently if necessary. Those are formal meetings. The executive directors talk to each other all the time informally, but as a formal matter, they meet quarterly to discuss and approve strategic decisions. Because of the small size of the committee and the small size of the collaborative, all of the organizations felt like all of the decisions that the governing committee would make needed to be unanimous. So if one of them, essentially it gives all of them a veto right, but that's the way they felt like they needed to operate. They felt like they needed to be in lockstep, totally in sync with the big picture strategic decisions. Having said that, the responsibilities of this committee were fairly limited and clearly defined to big picture decisions focused on really on 3 areas: on budget, on grant solicitation, and marketing. So in sum, we kept the structure pretty simple. We didn't put a whole lot of rules and procedures around it. We kept it flexible so that they would have the ability to make decisions that would benefit the collaborative.
But as a committee, they had a specific structure that they were working within. They had a quarterly meeting, they had a chair who was in charge each year, and they had a plan for how they were going to actually manage the process.
That's right.
Which is critical to a collaboration success, no matter which structure you use.
Right, and just, yes, they had that structure without overly burdensome sort of process and procedure
Yes.
that would slow them down.
Right. That's wonderful. Turning now to slide 15, let's focus on who's managing the day-to-day operations. So now we've got the big picture strategic decision-making addressed. But then you have to decide at the next level, and these three probably, I'll let Alan discuss that a little further, decide how they were going to actually manage the day-to-day operation. So you've decided on the strategy. The strategy is being continuously discussed and implemented, but who's actually implementing it is what we're going to turn to now. So who is going to make those day-to-day decisions? And the organizations as a whole need to decide that. That may be in the actual collaboration agreement, or it may just be decisions made by that committee or whatever structure you're going to use. Who's going to have the right to negotiate and sign contracts on behalf of the collaboration? Because again, it's not an organization, it's not a formal corporation that exists. So who's going to have the right to sign on behalf of this collaboration and oversee day-to-day operations and ultimately be responsible to outside parties regarding its activities? How is record keeping and reporting going to be accomplished? Alan alluded to this, where they helped one another in making sure that record keeping and reporting was done. So that's something that needs to be addressed. And then where are those records going to be kept is another important facet to be considering. And it sounds like these are sort of mundane issues, but they're important issues to be addressed at some point in setting up your collaboration. Communication, as I mentioned earlier, is critical. So how are the collaborators going to communicate on a day-to-day basis? Granted, they might have quarterly or monthly meetings as a group, but how are they going to communicate daily? Is it going to be by email, by phone? What mechanisms are going to be set up to address communication? And then who's going to do that communication, and how often is that going to happen? Another important aspect, which also Alan alluded to, is marketing and publicity. And the collaboratives, the folks involved in the collaboration should spend some time thinking through what kind of plan they want to have for marketing. What are their marketing goals? They may not have any marketing goals. This may be a small, a collaborative that's just a group of nonprofits that are just going to share resources and accomplish a goal, but that doesn't mean they want to be identified as this group as such. Or it may be really important to identify it in order for the public to be aware, to gain greater access to additional resources and funding. And it may be that the collaborative almost may become as large or bigger than each individual nonprofit in terms of from a marketing perspective. So all those things need to be considered.
So in the context of the case study, this is, as I mentioned at the outset, on the spectrum, there are aspects of this that were a little bit more like a coordination or a cooperation than a true collaborative. And this is probably the area where that is really the case here. In part because the organizations were providing day-to-day services that didn't really change all that much. So we set out the day-to-day services that each one provides on a list attached to the agreement. And then from there, the organizations largely act independently in providing their services to their clients. The biggest, because they are common clients, they are families who one organization may bring them in and recognize that there's a need for those clients to have services that another organization might provide. And so they're referred from one organization to the other to get the appropriate services. So the biggest potential issue in day-to-day operations of this collaborative are the referrals and someone falling through the cracks. So that is probably the biggest piece here that we were concerned about in dealing with day-to-day issues in formalizing the agreement. And one of the required duties of each organization is to refer clients and to keep track of those referrals. And so it's something that they all knew they needed to do, and they all do it, but it just helps to put it down on paper. The communication is a big part of that. We didn't really document too much about exactly how communication would occur and who would be responsible for it, other than just to say it needs to be done. Because it was a little bit hard to figure out exactly how you put that down in writing, but it is essential that communication, in this instance, communication has to be free-flowing. Monitoring the implementation of the strategy on a day-to-day basis really is up to, in our case, it's up to the fiscal agent, because they're primarily after going for common grant money to fund these common services they provide. So the fiscal agent is keeping track of funds, they're responsible for reporting, and the fiscal agent is the one in our case that has the ability to enter into contracts on behalf of the collaborative. As far as marketing, we kept that at, as I mentioned earlier, at sort of a higher level, big picture, because it was really important for the executive directors of each organization to be in agreement about how the collaborative would be marketed. So we left that sort of at the higher level. So the governing committee is responsible for setting the marketing strategy, but we didn't actually define how it's implemented on a day-to-day basis because we weren't sure at the outset how it should be dictated. And what we basically said was the governing committee can come back later on and set a policy to do that. So that's the way we approached it, rather than putting it in the agreement. And there are a couple of examples of things like that we basically said the governing committee can, if they need to, they can put a policy out rather than having it in a written agreement at the outset.
And in your example, that makes perfect sense, whereas that it wasn't so much the collaborative that was being recognized as it's almost its own entity outside of the group. It was making sure that no one was falling through the cracks.
That's right.
So from a publicity standpoint, it had a different approach.
Well, although they do market as a collaborative to basically to attract attention to the fact that together they can provide sort of this circle of services to the client group, and so yeah, they do actually market together. So that's an interesting mixture of how we approached it. The only other point I would make here in terms of day-to-day operation is that, as I mentioned earlier, all of the employees who are providing services to these clients are employees of their own organizations, and they're not employees of the collaborative itself. So that means that they have to work together. The employees of each organization have to work together very well as well. So, and they do, I think, a very good job of staying. I think one of the keys is, no matter what you put down in the agreement, there has to be a lot of work together, collaboration. It's a good word that comes to mind. On a regular basis, communication between these individuals to make their efforts work. So I think that probably covers it for day-to-day management.
Your point about employees is very important because the collaboration is not going to be its own corporate entity. The employees will have to be employed by one of the nonprofits or by a fiscal agent or their own nonprofit where they came from. They don't necessarily have to combine, but managing that is a little bit more complicated, and that's why if you turn to slide 16, the fiscal and financial management is so important, and designating a fiscal agent is critical. That fiscal agent can be somebody who is one of the nonprofits involved in the collaboration, or it can be a third party outside nonprofit. What comes to mind often is a community foundation that may set up a fund and manage those activities for the collaborative. It's important that whoever is the fiscal agent is a 501c3 recognized organization, so that donations and grant money so that you can obtain grant money, and that donations to the collaborative can be deductible by the donor. And it's also really important to designate that agent, because that's the organization or person that's going to be responsible for all the financial issues associated with the entity or with the collaboration. It's going to involve all the income will go on that Form 990 of that entity. Any bank accounts that are opened will be in the EIN of that fiscal agent, and everything that goes along with that. So auditing requirements and reporting requirements and accounting and record keeping all go within the realm of whoever is that fiscal agent. That doesn't mean, so let's say nonprofit A is the fiscal agent in the case of a collaborative, and there's four nonprofits involved. Maybe it is that each of the nonprofits has their own employees doing the work, and it may be that nonprofit A as fiscal agent is going to pay nonprofit B, nonprofit C, and nonprofit D for the costs associated with those employees working for the collaborative and their collaborative efforts. So money may transfer to the other entities and end up in their bank accounts ultimately, but it all needs to come into one specific fiscal agent and managed by one fiscal agent. And it's really important to identify that. And it's not something that can usually change. It's not something like a board chair that's going to be rotated. It's usually one that continues throughout. Another critical element.
Although I will say we did contemplate the fact that it might change. So
that anyway. Makes it far more complicated to do that. But it depends on the collaboration too, and how much money is involved in what the activities are. So I suppose it could change, but it would be far more complicated if it did. Alan mentioned developing a budget, and that this governing committee developed a budget for the collaboration. And that's, of course, critical every year to be developed, but then managing the budget and that bookkeeping and making sure that all the accounts are properly recorded and managed. Another key aspect to all of this is donor acknowledgement. So if you've got individuals donating or corporations donating to the collaborative, the fiscal agent, whoever that is, needs to make sure they're giving proper donor acknowledgements. And those will be through that individual fiscal agent. So if it's charity A or nonprofit A that is the fiscal agent, those donor acknowledgements will come from charity A, with charity A's potentially EIN number, but point out that those funds will be used towards the collaborative effort, whatever it may be. And it's important to make sure those are tracked and given out. It may also be that if you have a large grant that you're receiving, whether it be federal or other grant, there may need to be an audit of the financial aspects of the collaborative, depending on how large it is. And so that also needs to be overseen. Ultimately, the income from the collaborative will fall into, in my example, Charity A's Form 990 and its overall audit that it may need, depending on its size. Because ultimately the money is coming into that entity and being distributed to the rest of the collaborative efforts through that organization.
So as Robin sort of indicated, I think the answer to the question on the slide, will a fiscal agent be designated, is almost always going to be yes. And it's really sort of the answer to the second question, whether it's one of the collaborators or a third party that entities have to grapple with. So in comparison to the prior topic where our case study was sort of to the more cooperative end of the spectrum, this is the instance where this collaborative is a true collaboration in all respects, most collaborative. And in our case, we answered that question about whether the fiscal agent would be one of the collaborators or a third party, with it being one of the entities involved. And from there, of course, the challenge is to designate specifically what responsibilities the fiscal agent will have. In our case, the fiscal agent has a lot of responsibility. They are responsible for tracking all the money that comes in from grants for the collaborative specific purposes. They're responsible for distributing funds from those grants to support the work of the collaborative. And they are responsible not only for acknowledging the donations that might come in, but in the case of big grants, they're responsible for reporting back to donors for compliance with any conditions that the grants might have. And as you mentioned, the fiscal agent also has to be prepared to deal with the Form 990 reporting, and so that's not an insignificant task for the fiscal agent to take on. And there was some discussion about how that would be handled, and that is part of the reason why we contemplated that it might rotate at some point, because there was sort of a feeling that it needed to be shared pain at some point.
But on the other hand, it can be a benefit too, because it makes that organization financially look much larger. Even though the money is going to the collaborative, if you're going out to look at somebody's Form 990 in terms of making a donation, or if the individual organization was trying to get its own grant funding for other activities, that organization looks far more substantial than the other organizations will, because all that funding is flowing through it.
Right.
So one of the benefits, though, of the pain is that if you go to like a community foundation and use a third-party agent, they are then responsible for all of that. Right. And it does in some ways eliminate some of the individual bickering that can occur over money, as in any situation. Right. Relationship can occur as to how all those issues are addressed, and then the pain is sort of removed from the group as a whole and left up to somebody. Now you usually have to pay for that service, but it may be well worth it.
Which is why we didn't pursue a third party agent, because of the potential cost involved. So and I guess a final just key point here is that even though the fiscal agent is responsible for all of these things, all of the members of the collaborative are responsible for keeping certain records and providing information to the fiscal agent, so that the fiscal agent can fulfill all of these reporting obligations. And so that's one of, as I think I mentioned earlier, that's one of the required duties of all of the members, is that they not only keep track of the information, but they actually provide it to the fiscal agent when the fiscal agent requests it. So,
which is pretty important.
Yes. So I think we can turn to the other aspects of financial management as well.
Yes, there's a couple other financial management issues that I do want to address, and that is contribution of resources from collaborators. So not only do you need to identify who's going to oversee and manage your efforts, but you also need to talk about what resources each of the nonprofits may be contributing, if any. And then how those resources will be maintained. So if you contribute resources, is it a license agreement to the collaboration to use it, or are they actually outright contributing those assets? And there needs to be some evidence that it's being contributed to the collaboration. And then what happens to those assets when the collaboration ends? And now all this will not necessarily be in your collaboration agreement, but as these things come up and occur, they need to be accounted for and managed so that it's very clear, because each individual nonprofit will have an audit, and if they tell their auditors, well, we don't have that property anymore, we gave it to the collaboration, they're going to say, well, where's the evidence of that you no longer own that property, but it's part of the collaborative. So it's important to take the extra steps to make sure it's being done correctly. And then the last thing, which we've alluded to a number of times already, is the fundraising aspects. And making sure that the fundraising aspects are clearly identified. Also along those lines, if you have identified a fiscal agent, and let's say you're fundraising outside of, most of our clients are in Georgia, but let's say the reach of this collaborative is beyond the state of Georgia, then that entity that's a fiscal agent may need to register for charitable solicitation in other states. And that's an important thing to take into account. Where's the solicitation taking place, and what's the effect on the fiscal agent to meet its requirements under charitable solicitation laws? And then, identifying, as we said before, under conflicts of interest, which grants are included, what's off limits, what's on limits, what are we going after and what are we not going after, so that each of the separate nonprofits knows what it can individually do from a fundraising perspective. And then finally, another thing to think about is if you're going to hire paid solicitors or fundraising professionals, who is hiring them, how is that being considered, and for what purposes? Because each individual nonprofit may have its own fundraising professional. So that needs to be also clearly defined throughout the process, and the responsibilities of each.
So on these two issues, really, the contribution of resources issue was not one that we had to deal with much here, because there was no financial contribution by each of the entities to the collaboration. and there were no tangible assets being contributed other than the office space, which they shared. We did deal with in the agreement within the office space about how data lines would be provided, and you know how much time each organization had in the office and what the office hours would be and things like that. But in terms of real resource contribution, we didn't have to deal with that in this agreement. We did need to deal, as I mentioned earlier, the fundraising activities, which I mentioned also that the governing committee oversees all that. But going back to your question earlier about this, the governing committee or the organizations didn't want to restrict any organization from pursuing a grant that they might want to pursue. So they created a structure where everything that would benefit the collaborative needs to be approved by the committee. But each organization, once it's approved by the committee, each organization can then go and pursue that grant on their own. So with support from the others as they need it. But so the committee serves as a governor and a check on the grants that they pursue, but then they all can go out and try to get the funding on their own. So it's sort of an interesting way that they agreed to go about that. But that was what made sense for them. It took quite a bit of discussion. Probably spent more time talking about this topic than anything else as we worked through the agreement. Because we were trying to figure out how to meet the needs, not only of the collaborative and the common clients that they were serving, but allow these entities to continue to provide their services outside of a collaborative in other areas. And so that's why it was a little tricky and probably a little unusual, but that was the result that we came up with. So.
And I've seen where each organization has its own already relationships. So one collaboration I was working with, one of the nonprofits had a very strong relationship with a bank, and they said, well, no one can go after this bank for funding because we have a very strong relationship here, and it's not going to be part of this collaboration either.
Right.
So those are the kinds of discussions that need to be had.
Specific grant targets are off limits. That's an interesting approach.
Absolutely.
Too.
Yeah. Well, just to define certain things where you have a long-term 20-year relationship with a donor.
Right.
That is not part of what the collaboration effort is going to be about, that they want to protect that. So those are the things that may also come up as well.
Makes sense.
So we have a question. Someone's asking, is it possible to get a sample of a collaboration contract or a resource where they can find a sample to show to their board of directors?
Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta does not give out sample contracts. Our malpractice insurance would not appreciate that very much. And it's really not effective to start with a sample agreement because each agreement, and Alan can talk about this as he's recently written one, each agreement is going to be so different. Each collaboration is going to be very different. And a contract is only as good as the facts that are in it. So it's really going to be very specific to whatever the collaboration activity is. So to start with a sample that may involve a highly complex collaboration when yours might be quite simple won't really be very effective. That said, as a client of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, when you get to the point of needing an attorney to help draft that kind of collaboration agreement, we can provide that hopefully to you. Most of our clients that have started down this path have actually used the materials here today as a guideline for their board of directors in thinking through the issues they need to consider in establishing a collaboration.
I think we're probably on to
Slide 18.
Slide 18, handling change in the collaboration. This really is an important topic. And one where a thoughtful approach at the outset can head off trouble down the road for the collaboration and the entities. Essentially, you're dealing with the what ifs, particularly when things go wrong. As I've mentioned several times in different contexts, we made this collaborative very flexible, particularly in terms of geography and the possibility of adding new members. That was one of the changes that we could foresee, the potential for growth, for expansion in different ways. The trade-off, of course, is that if you provide for some of this flexibility for growth, that you have inevitably some issues that you don't address. And so you have an agreement that can't possibly foresee everything, but that's pretty much the nature of all of these kind of agreements, I think. So we did allow for expansion. We also contemplated what would happen if a member needed to leave the collaborative for some reason. We addressed it by basically saying that a member can withdraw and the others can choose to continue the collaborative if they wanted to, or they could end it. So we, again, provided flexibility in that decision-making process. We also addressed whether the members could remove an organization if they needed to. If an organization was behaving badly or not contributing in the way that they were supposed to, we addressed that and created a mechanism that could happen without terminating the entire collaborative, which we felt like was pretty important. In terms of winding up and ending a collaboration, we have a fairly detailed provision in our agreement that deals with winding up and settling up. I won't try to describe it in detail, but it is a very important issue to address. And the other part of that is determining when, not if, but when a collaboration should. And we didn't really talk about a term of a collaboration as one of the key issues, but that is a key issue. Is this collaboration, and it ties in with scope, should the collaboration have a specific project? Is it set up for a specific project, and so therefore it's over when that project is done? Is it an ongoing thing, and you want to have sort of an indefinite life? You know, there are many different ways that you can deal with it, and it depends on the specific facts and circumstances of the collaboration. In our case, we essentially set up one-year terms that automatically renew. So in effect, it's indefinite until one of the organizations raises its hand and says we need to get out. So it has an undefined lifespan at this point. But there are lots of different options in terms of dealing with when it should end and then how it should end. In some, these are tough issues, and it's usually best to address these issues with experienced legal counsel to make sure that you don't miss the what-ifs that I mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, especially winding up any activities.
And because you have to deal with, if you have assets in there that are shared, if you have intellectual property that's in there that's shared, you need to have a process up front that will address how those things are dealt with rather than leaving it to the end when it may be very difficult to resolve those issues.
Which leads actually right into the next slide, which I'm just going to briefly cover, which is a couple other issues to consider for a collaboration is intellectual property, and insurance is another issue. With regards to intellectual property, will the collaboration have its own intellectual property? Will it have a defined name? Will it have a logo? Might it have curriculum or other materials or books, or photographs or marketing materials? Will it have its own website? All those things need to be considered, and if it does have those, who owns that intellectual property? If you actually go to register, obtain a trademark registration for the name and logo, or copyright registration for some of the materials, who's going to own that when the collaboration ends? And that's something that needs to be carefully thought through. And will you need licensing agreements to use the individual logos and names of the individual collaborators? So a whole host of intellectual property issues that may need to be addressed depending on the size and scope and depth of your collaborative effort. The other thing I just want to simply mention is insurance. Depending on what the activities are of that collaboration, additional insurance may need to be considered. The fiscal agent may need to obtain that. You need to look at the specific activities and talk to your insurance brokers, each of the nonprofits involved, to see what might need to be considered from an insurance perspective. And that's going to vary dramatically based on the activities that are being conducted and how they're being conducted and so on. Right.
So just real quickly, in our case study, in terms of intellectual property, things that relate to the collaborative will stay with the collaborative. Even, they sort of will die when the collaborative is dissolved or winds up, if that happens. And things that are, while the collaborative agreement is in effect, the intellectual property that's related to the collaborative can only be used outside of work for the collaborative with permission of the other participating organizations. Work product that any individual organization develops in the process of doing work for the collaborative can stay with that organization. So if there's a manual or a process that they develop, they keep it. They don't have to turn that over to the collaborative. But each organization does grant a non-exclusive right to the other organizations to use that work product in the process of providing services to their common clients. So I think that's probably a pretty typical way to handle those kinds of things. On insurance, we did define in the agreement that each entity has to have its own insurance and just its standard general liability, auto, workers' comp policies, and we set the limits that they're required to have in the agreement. In addition to these issues, there are other contract provisions to consider, and that's shown on slide 20. I won't go through this list at this point. I just wanted to highlight a few things that we discussed in our agreement. One is the one that I already mentioned, which is the length of the collaboration, the first note on this slide. You know, I've already talked about it a little bit, so I won't go into that in any more detail. But ultimately, you do need to consider what the length of the collaboration should be. And then on there, the third point, indemnification, how each organization is going to indemnify the others in the collaborative is an important point to cover as well. And then finally, fees and expenses. In our case, each organization bears its own fees and expenses for the services they're providing to their clients. So to conclude, we have some lessons learned here on this last slide, and I want to emphasize two things, the first point and the last point. I think we've made this point pretty clearly already, but defining the scope clearly and early in the process is essential. If there's not agreement on the scope of the relationship, both in terms of what is in and what is not, there's really no point in discussing anything else. That has to be established at the outset. And the last point, expect change and the unexpected. Your documentation needs to allow for flexibility and the need and the ability to deal with changing circumstances. An inflexible document could easily lead to a bad ending for the relationship between the parties. And just one final note about our process. This it's not necessarily a quick process to get something like this documented. We started with initial discussion in August of 2011. After discussing how to approach it, we decided to go with the term sheet approach that I mentioned earlier. Because of the commitments and the busyness of the executive directors of these organizations, the term sheet was finalized in November, so 3 months later, but was then put aside because of holidays and other things. And so we didn't get back on track until March of the next year. And then, well, actually, I'm sorry, we didn't even finalize the term sheet until April of that next year. So it was drafted, it was almost finalized, and then another 6 months passed before we actually finalized it. And then we moved to an agreement, and we didn't get the agreement done until November. So the process took over a year to go from beginning discussion, and this was when the scope had already been defined, to getting to a final agreement. It could easily go much faster than that, but I just wanted to sort of
But it
say,
usually doesn't.
Yeah.
It usually takes a lot of time and energy and is a long process. And to your point, it raises the level of importance of the need to have good legal counsel to assist you in this, because we've talked about a letter of intent, we've talked about a contract, we've talked about licensing agreements, we've talked about a lot of different tangential issues around these kinds of collaboratives, all of which involve competent legal counsel helping throughout the process.
And this agreement, if prepared properly, will provide a framework for the collaborative to outlast the individuals involved and fulfill the mission that those organizations want to see fulfilled.
Are there any questions, additional questions? We'll wait for that question to come in.
Oh, it's a thank you.
All right.
Well, with that, thank you very much for your time today.